start. My name's David Simon. I'm the director of the Genocide Studies program, and I'd like to welcome everybody to the first of our, at this point, it's 2 seminar series presentations for the spring. There are a couple of other events that looks like we'll be able to schedule. And I encourage you, if you're not on the Genocide Studies program's mailing list, to join that so that you can hear more about them. Before I go any further, though, I just wanted to acknowledge that Yale University and the Genocide Studies program would like to acknowledge the indigenous people and nations, including the Mohegan, Mashantucket Pequot, Eastern Pequot, Shagatakok, Golden Hill Pagusset, Neontic, and the Quinnipiac and other Algonquin-speaking peoples who have stewarded through the generations the lands and waterways in what is now the state of Connecticut. We honor and respect that enduring relationship that exists between these peoples and this land. So with that, welcome. I'd like to welcome you all to this talk, and I'd like to welcome Wendy Lower to talk about her book, The Ravine. We are really lucky to have her. It's wonderful that she is actually in New Haven this semester. And quite terrible that we're all confined to basically to our homes, and that we're unable to enjoy the sort of full extent of the collegial interactions that we otherwise would be. But Wendy is a senior scholar, a Rosenberg senior scholar with the Fortunoff Video Archive for Holocaust Testimonies at Yale this term. She is, when she's not at Yale, the John K. Roth Professor of History and the director of the Mgrublian Center for Human Rights at Claremont McKenna College. She's among other things, the chair of the academic committee of the U.S. Holocaust Memorial Museum, and of course, an author who, having written The Ravine, A Family, a Photograph, and a Holocaust Massacre Revealed. I've had the privilege of reading this book, and I can only encourage those of you who have logged on to do the same. Go out, buy it, order it. On the Genocide Studies webpage, there's links not just to Amazon, Barnes & Noble, which is local, but also the Strand, which is independent and also delivers to your door. No endorsement that would jeopardize our nonprofit designation intended. But the book is a wonderful book and disturbing because, and I don't want to say much more about it because, of course, we have Wendy here to walk us through it to some extent. But the book starts with a photograph, sort of almost serendipitously stumbled upon, a photograph that raises questions about an incident. But then in the course of trying to address those questions, Wendy artfully takes the reader through all sorts of questions about the Holocaust itself, about Holocaust education, about memory and memorialization that left me pondering, and I think will leave you pondering as well. So with that very briefest of introductions and hopefully a little bit of a teaser that may sell some books, let me turn it over to Wendy. Thank you for being here and for sharing your time with the Genocide Studies program, and I look forward to hearing what you have to say.
Thank you so much, David. It's just a pleasure, as you said, to actually be physically here at Yale this semester, and I'm grateful to Stephen Naran and the team over at the Fortunoff for inviting me, and the Mgrublian Center for making all the arrangements. And in spite of COVID, we are really having a very productive time here. The library is open, the archives are open. I feel really, a lot of my colleagues are very envious because I can actually go in and look at original papers and get into the digital collections. And so it's just a real treat to be here. It's always a good thing to be on sabbatical. This is one of the big perks of being in academia and being in research, to have that time to start new projects and to, in this case, share my findings on this project and being part of this community here at Yale. It's just a phenomenal institution. So congratulations to you for being here. And we know each other as well. I just want to give a little shout out to an organization that we have created together for higher ed, and that's a national network of centers for Holocaust, genocide, and human rights in the United States. And that network is alive and well right now. And well, it's just getting off the ground, but stay tuned. We have another conference coming up, and the mission of that program is to bring people like David and I together who run these centers at institutions across the US, and that we can share resources and deal with issues as they arise, whether or not it's research challenges or things happening in the public realm that might in any way inhibit our work and our teaching of these subjects. So that's kind of the activist program that we're collaborating on in the best sense of the word. And I just wanted to acknowledge that and David's contribution to that national program. So thank you for that introduction. I'm delighted by the response to the Ravine. It's been really unusual, the emails I've been getting from people who I guess they're getting one of the main arguments in the book, which is that a single image can put things in motion, that there's an incredible amount of agency, although it looks like an inert source. It's just sitting there right on the table as I first looked at it. But it can not only, turn the wheels of justice, but it can also encourage people to look closer and try to understand the history. So that's what is the inspiration behind this entire project. So, I mean, we've all seen how one photograph of suffering or violence can move audience and propel humanitarian action and social justice. And we can think about iconic images of atrocities and how genocide has been represented in visual form, or mass atrocities, not necessarily genocide, a naked girl fleeing a napalm attack in Vietnam, and even the little boy, Alan Kurdi, who washed up on the beach of Bodrum in his little red t-shirt. And that really, changed. It was a galvanizing moment for European immigration policy, especially Merkel's response. Or here in the United States, images of lynchings, images of children being separated at the border from their families. And lastly, Holocaust, what we think of as the Holocaust, the kind of visual archive of the Holocaust. So one of the most famous pictures that is displayed in museums around the world, and we see it in the newspapers and on the internet, so-called The Last Man in Vinica. We don't even know the date. We don't know the photographer. We just have this image. I'll show it to you in a moment. Or think about the railway lines leading to Auschwitz, a kind of, in fact, those images, when we show them and we talk to them with our students, I find that they don't really know much about, what it is, what they're looking at, what the context is, let alone anything about the photographer. So these images become part of our collective memory of particular historical disasters. They're widely circulated and displayed, but often with little information about the circumstances or persons pictured in them. So as an historian of the Holocaust, I was especially concerned about the lack of research on rare photographs that became standard illustrations that weren't really studied as historical documents. Many of the most graphic images were the subject of scholarly debates. Let me open up my screen now. We can start looking at what I'm talking about. Put up my desktop and my display here. Here we go. These kinds of images that are, you may recognize them. They've been the subject of debates as far as what should or should not be displayed, but not intense investigation to what are the rules of how they should be studied or researched, what are the ethics and methods of inquiry, and could visual evidence like a single photograph open up new lines of inquiry and discovery about the Holocaust. So this was something that I started to reflect on, and it really was the start of this project. And I want to warn everybody that we're talking about how genocide is represented visually, and the kinds of forensic kinds of research that can be done, and the questions that can arise in that process, that research process, the discovery process. And I'm sorry, these these are real photos from the Holocaust, they are very disturbing, and this is the one that we're going to focus on today. And I just wanted to kind of provide that warning to you, that you feel free to turn your screen off and listen if you would prefer that, rather than look at these images. Clearly, these kinds of images of corpses, this kind of the nudity here, this image of this close, this is the last man in Vinica, iconic image. They raise all kinds of questions about whether or not we've become desensitized, Susan Sontag's argument, inured in some way to this history because of the prevalence of these images. Are they denigrating to the victims? Yes. Do they reveal anything more about, like, this image, this stable image? It doesn't tell us about the operations of Auschwitz. It's just a, architectural kind of image, right? Or Anne Frank, and how that becomes a kind of meta narrative of hope, and despite it all, life goes. So these images evoke all kinds of, the little boy from the Warsaw Ghetto, Ivana Gorod, very famous image of a family actually being shot, being hunted down. That's a security police official in southern Ukraine. Often this is cropped and you only see this part. See, there are more guns there. So the issue of the cropping of these images is also about the manipulation of our memory and of our evidence. This is the image today that is the focus of our conversation. The image that really just shocked me and then stayed with me until this day, until the first time I saw it in 2009. And it was brought to me at the archives of the US HMM in DC, the US Holocaust Memorial Museum, where a lot of research starts. It is an interesting place as far as folks coming in with material, something they've found in an archive, in an attic, given to them from a relative, and come to that kind of a location to find out more, or sometimes to donate it to the museum. Now, in this case, in 2009, I was there working on another investigation, and my colleague who greeted these two journalists from Prague said, "Oh, okay, what are we looking at?" Well, this image, as it turned out, because it was part of a testimony, contained the location, Myropil, Ukraine, about 120 miles, 150 miles west of Kiev, so kind of west central Ukraine. That we knew. We knew the location, we knew the date, October 13th, 1941, and we had the name of the photographer, Lubomir Skrovina, who was Slovakian. So that was what we had to start with in 2009. And I decided to put this to the test, so kind of the challenge of how much more can we find out as we study it closely over time, as I drew on resources in Holocaust scholarship, which over the decades, the field has really taken off since the 90s in an interdisciplinary way. The resources have expanded over the decades, the infrastructure for that research and the funding and so forth. And a lot of strides have been made in Holocaust research as far as the way that we approach the history from all these different angles: Nazi documentation, testimony from war crimes cases, going to the crime scene, looking at the terrain, looking at the topography, studies and testimony, whether they're written or they're oral, whether they're from perpetrators or bystanders, the gendered elements of that, analysis of clothing here, material culture, uniforms. It's a incredibly rich field of scholarship. So I was sitting there at the museum in 2009. I would go on to actually direct the Mandel Center, the research institute of the museum, and spent a lot of time there, and thought about to what extent all these different approaches and interdisciplinary methods could be applied to a single photograph like that. And so how could my research discovery also point out to readers and to students what's available, what can one do in these circumstances? And perhaps, that might apply to other photographs. I mentioned photographs of lynching and other historical mass atrocities and crimes left unsolved, and communities that are looking for redress and reform. So these were some of the things that I was thinking about as I embarked on this project and as I was writing it. So we can immediately see, or I could immediately see, that it is a photograph of the Holocaust. I see the Nazi uniforms, the wartime era of the civilians, the old rifles, this little boy with his family, holding the woman's hand. She's wearing a polka dotted dress. He's barefooted. We can see the men standing together. I know this is in Ukraine, 1941. These are Red Army coats. There's an armband on those militiamen. So they've been kind of the locals who've been recruited. At this time, they weren't in a mobile unit. What else do we see there? We see the Ukrainian, it's hard because I can't see the full picture because of the little boxes, our faces, but I know it well. But we see what's really striking, the Germans and Ukrainians are shooting, and there's action, there's motion, right? So it's incontrovertible evidence of murder underway, taking place. And it's absolutely clear that the guns are being fired. We can see their expressions in their faces. We can see the smoke, the kind of ballistic forensic evidence there. So as I embarked on this, I thought about how to produce the book as kind of elements of the photograph and as research challenges. We're going to start with the shoes and we're going to end with the shoes, because a photograph like this, which is so disturbing and so revealing, just even at first glance, there was always this kind of image down below of the shoes, this the emptiness and the silence of those shoes, and the question as to who wore them. And they look like men's shoes. And that raises questions as to the gendered kind of way of killing, as far as killing the men first, who pose the greatest threat to the genocide heirs, and then the follow-up of killing the women and children. The nature, the importance of the landscape. This is broad daylight. Father Desbois, French priest, has been working in the former Soviet Union, identifying thousands of mass graves, and also discovering how the so-called Holocaust by bullets, the mass murder of Jews in the former Soviet Union, in Ukraine, at least up to 1.4 million. When I first started working on this in the early 90s, my first trip to Ukraine was the summer of 92. The estimates were around 900,000, and that has changed in the past decades. More of these sites have been uncovered, more victims, and the growing realization that survival rates were incredibly low, less than kind of 2% in some communities in Ukraine. That every fourth victim of the Holocaust who died was a resident within what is the borders of Ukraine today. Just how significant Ukraine is historically, as far as not only Jewish history, but and the concentration of Jews there, and the what was the Pale of Settlement, but for the Nazis, very much of as much of a target population as what was carried out in Poland and the Polish Jewish community and the mass gassing facilities there. So this Holocaust by bullets in broad daylight, what is that reality of that phenomenon? What is that? Where does that lead us as far as inquiries, the questions we pose, and the history of genocide? The landscape, the terrain, the environmental history part of this, which is also another kind of growing field in general, but also within genocide and Holocaust studies. I thought this was a ravine because the Nazis and their collaborators in Ukraine, what was documented and became more evident as I did more field work, is how much they put nature to work, whether it was the use of the rivers, the swamps, drowning the victims, the ravine, as far as natural kinds of mass graves. And then, of course, in Babi Yar outside of Kiev, more than 33,000 killed at the end of September. They later dynamited those ravine walls to kind of cover up the crime. So they used the dirt, the soil, the terrain to facilitate the crime and also to cover it up. But as we know in environmental history, those traces don't disappear. The soil composition changes, the depressions of the landscape change. So that's also a kind of those are also traces that provide more information. Here, the collaborators, the German officials, to what extent could I identify the units based on a study of their uniforms and the insignia on their caps? The ballistics, the smoke, what does this tell us when we see this kind of haloing effect of the smoke above the woman's head? Now, many people have asked me the question, how could such a photograph, be taken like this? I mean, it is a stable image. We have images from Auschwitz-Birkenau that, or of other mass shootings where the photographer is taking them through through a coat buttonhole or, quickly through a window. They're unstable images. The perspectives are a little bit off. There's not much of an aesthetic per se because they're taken in threatening, vulnerable circumstances. So the Nazis didn't want an image like this to survive. As the mass shootings were occurring in 1941, starting the murderous phase of the final solution, numerous orders were issued: do not take photos of atrocities. At the same time, the Germans and their collaborators were, many of them had cameras in their pockets, and camera photographing of the victory, of the triumphalism of the war was greatly encouraged. This was a period of what was considered what I call kind of the camera craze. It was an advertisement here called, it's a German military magazine for ordinary soldiers. This is a promotion for this camera, and they're calling it the optical Panzer, like that this camera is so sturdy, when you bring it into battle, it will survive the warfare. So bring your camera. The Leica pocket camera was patented in 1925. The Zeiss Icon hit the market in 1933. That's the camera that our photographer here, that's a Zeiss Icon, and that's our photographer right there. I'll tell you more about him in a moment. And so by 1939, something like 10% of the German population owned cameras. In fact, when Jews were deported, among the items that they were told that they had to leave behind, besides jewelry and artwork and other valuables, the Germans very specifically, leave your pocket cameras behind, because those were then put back into circulation. And Goebbels embedded something like 15,000 photojournalists in all theaters of the war and produced an estimated 3.5 million images. So here we have this phenomenon. It started in the First World War, but really taking off given the consumption of the portable camera. And our photographer is this hobby photographer. He's the company scribe for his Slovakian unit, and mobilized to go to participate in Operation Barbarossa with the Germans alongside Croatians and Romanians and Hungarians in this kind of Axis attempt to defeat Bolshevism. And part of that, of course, was this notion of Judeo-Bolshevism. So to defeat the Bolshevik Soviet Union, and as they ideologically saw it, the Jews who were at the center of that regime. Here's another image of the Agfa Photo Company, and they're saying this is the camera is the bridge between you and the home front, and you can share your images. So this is part of the promotion of the kind of irony here of the promotion of the image. And of course, in German culture as well, it was kind of, we've got a couple of books that are coming out. I just want to mention this, that some albums are starting to emerge from German families, including one from Sobibor that was made by the Deputy Commandant Niemann. This was something that albums were made, like the Auschwitz album, that were a source of pride. So underlings would make albums of their, to show off that they had completed their part of the final solution. So it's also part of a culture of, within the, among the genocidaires, of bragging about, of demonstrating their achievements. So it's an interesting moment in the history of photography and visual culture. Now, as I embarked on the research, of course, I wanted to go back to the location, to the crime scene. And I want to help you here. Here's Mariupol right here. I just want to situate it geographically for you. And I said it was about 100 miles plus from Kiev, and there it is. And this is actually a very old map of Jewish communities in Ukraine going back to medieval times. So it's a shtetl. It's a small place. At most, it had probably 4,500 Jews in the 19th century, and then the emigration as of that point and the deaths during the First World War. By the time the Germans arrived in 41, there were about maximum about 1,400 Jews, as far as I was able to calculate when they arrived in this town, but it was historically very important. This is what I found when I went there the first time in the summer of 2014. It has a history actually of more kind of Polish dominance and Polish rule than Soviet or Russian. But of course, this is the Soviet system was the most recent. So this is the one that we can see today most visibly, the remnants of that. And the shooting scene, I mentioned the Polish history and the layers here of the history of Polish, Jewish, Russian, Ukrainian, because it was this Polish fortress, the manor of Count Hutychowski, where this murder was carried out on this, as what it was his estate, the Count's estate, up on the hill above the river. And so everybody today who's still there, and has been converted into a Soviet military base, that same space. The locals, point up when I talk to them about. They always point up and talk about this Polish fortress as the location, and it is within about a 5-minute walk of this site here. This is the central marketplace. That's an empty. This is exactly as I found it. This is not staged. That's an empty champagne bottle there, and so just a lot of debris here. And this is a monument in Mariupol to the Second World War and the peaceful Soviet citizens who perished. And it's striking because of, even when I think about those shoes in the photograph as well, is the absence and silences and the holes here, the greenery there between those buildings is not, was not always the case. And those are not very tall trees. That used to be kind of the center of Jewish life. It used to be the market square. And in even some of the memories of the Ukrainians I spoke to, of the bustling kind of tempo, the weekly bazaars, trading that occurred there, and the interaction between or among Jews and Ukrainians and what was left of the Polish population, and some Russians. And, so it just to stand there and see kind of in 2014 what remains, and to think about how in the wake of genocide, when entire populations are, removed, what that does demographically and socioeconomically to those places. And of course, this is also the result of the collapse of the Soviet Union and the hyperinflation in Ukraine and Ukraine struggles in the 1990s. Moving out from the marketplace, and this is the area where the Jews were gathered. The photos from October 13th, 1941, they were gathered there the night before, and forced to walk down in this direction, the opposite direction, this man on his bicycle, and down through here. And the shooting site was just down the road. This picture is important for, it's another picture that Skrovina took. I'm moving now into the actual crime scene. And when I went back to Mariupol the first time and started to search for the actual location and talk to the local population, they didn't bring me to the right crime scene. they brought me to a ravine. They actually brought me to a ravine. There was a ravine in town where the killing took place of the so-called specialists in January 42. But they didn't take me to the site that is the focus of our photograph. The focus of our photograph, that site that Skrovina left evidence for us that actually he was at on that day, and I'll tell you how he got there. In the park, where the Polish Manor exists, on that particular day, there were actually more than one graves that were dug on that day. As the shooting began, the Germans, who had calculated the number of victims and thereby the area that they needed to dig, or force the Jews to dig their own grave in Ukrainian peasant girls, they realized mid-massacre, during the action, that they needed to quickly dig more graves. And so we not only have the picture that I showed you that Skrovina took of that family, but Skrovina took actually 5 images that we know of from that massacre. He was there for more than a few minutes, and they are probably standing, circulating around freely. He had the permission of the Germans to take these pictures. And so when I went to the Prague archive, I found this additional image, and I just wanted to put this in right now, because a couple of things that were additionally revealing that add to the other image. So now it's not this singular image, but it's now what would be 5 images in total out of 7 that he could take with that camera, with that film that he had in that camera. That's the importance of the material culture of the object that he used to take the pictures, that we can actually count the number of prints he could make on the scene. And this is then a second print, and it became really important because here, I think what's here is an armband, that she's wearing an armband, and that is a Jewish star. So that's potentially another piece of evidence in terms of the identities of the victims. And as well, we have a front view of the perpetrators that we didn't have before. And now I can really see their uniform, the uniform here. And that's why I'm showing that picture, because that is not the uniform of an SS man. It is not the uniform of a regular German soldier. It's not the uniform of an ordinary policeman. And in fact, all these units swept through that region in the summer and fall of 41. And I was digging around the archives in Order Police Battalion 303 and Einsatzgruppe C, going down and trying to make facial matches and trying to match uniforms and trying to place them in Mariupol on October 13th, 1941. And those German killing units weren't there on October 13th, 41, the ones that are doing most of the killing at this time. These are the uniforms of finance guards, of customs officials, of the men who who are at the post office, who are at the train station checking packages. They were recruited on the spot, and now we see 3 here, by the SS, who came into town on a Sunday night, the night before the killing on that Monday. And I'm moving to the slide because I know that picture is very disturbing. And on that Sunday night, the SS came in and they went into the canteen, the local kind of hall where the German officials would hang out, and then they were playing Scott, they were playing cards, and the SS man said, "Who wants to carry out this action tomorrow? Why are there Jews still in this town? I thought they were all gone. And who's going to carry this out tomorrow?" And they were involved in the organization, but then they left, and it was this customs unit that took over in carrying out the action. And so these individuals who are in that photo, these shooters, these killers, are all volunteer. These are Ukrainians who volunteered when the Germans came in, and these are individuals whose job, as it were, was not to carry out these mass shootings, but they wanted to. And they are then, the notion of collaboration here to me is especially powerful because they're volunteering, they are shoulder to shoulder, they're shooting innocent Jewish women and children, families. We know from the photographer, he overheard these Ukrainians calling out the names of the victims, they're neighbors. But these individuals, the Germans don't speak Ukrainian, these Germans don't speak Russian, and these are not ethnic Germans, these are ethnic Ukrainians that they don't have the same language. So there must have been an interpreter there, perhaps one of the individuals here. And of course, we have our Slovakian photographer. So this reality of Slovakian men, Ukrainian, German, shooting this woman like this, these men carrying this out is really quite startling. So what happened to the Ukrainians in the image? I was really keen on focusing on the perpetrators at first because one of the Ukrainian killers was 17 years old when he was doing this shooting. He was a minor. And this case that was eventually, I tracked down with colleagues of the Ukrainians in the picture, and you can recognize this gentleman here from the photo. It started in 1985, and the defendants, the three defendants, the trial was in late 86, early 87. They were, two of them were executed by firing squad in January 87, and the one who was a minor was given 15 years prison and sent into Russia. We don't know what happened to him. So it's so close to the end of the Soviet Union, the collapse of the Soviet Union, and it's kind of overlapping with Ukraine gaining its independence in August 91, that I thought possibly one of the killers might still be around, or I could perhaps interview him. So I was really focused at first on trying to track down the killers. And here we have this more satisfying, if you will, case of justice. Although I agree with Susie Linfield, I'm not in favor of the death penalty, but this image and the fact that the killers here were actually captured and convicted was more satisfying than the German case. The German case, which was started in 1969, and I should stress that the investigations that occurred against the Germans and Ukrainians did not benefit from the photograph. The photograph was sitting in the archive in Prague, the place where the journalists had found it and brought it to museum in DC. So these photographs were not in any way helpful to these cases. The Germans, in 1969, one of the comrades of the who was in that unit, of the Customs Guard unit, he walked into a police station outside of Hanover in a small town in January 69 and just said, "I want to report a crime," which to me was really striking that, 20 plus years later, this former, member of this unit, which was involved in these atrocities, walks in and says, "I want to report a crime." And his motives are mixed, and we can talk about that. But it did generate the creation of a file. It was a very slim file, very perfunctory kind of investigation, but more testimony from the Germans, including those killers, Voigt and Kuska, especially from Kuska. One of the killers could not be found. His whereabouts was not determined. But it was fascinating to compare the photograph with the German testimony, which claimed that they were not doing any of the shooting, that they weren't there. I mean, the lies and the ways of defense and perjuring was, that much more glaring when I had that photo. So their testimony did not match up to the photo. The Ukrainian case and the testimony collected there absolutely matched up with the photo. And the Soviet prosecutor, he forced these Ukrainians, defendants and witnesses, to go back to the crime scene and reenact and point out and stand at that same place that we see in the photograph where they stood in 1941. So it was a very detailed case. And here's a sketch of what they produced. And the defendants are signing this and agreeing to this, that here's our market square here that we saw in the photograph from the summer of 2014. And here they were forced to march down that man was on his bicycle. If we had continued down, we go down this path here, the Mirapole Park, and then through here, and this is this forested area. This is the fortress. There's the River Sluch down below, and this is the actual site and the mass graves that were dug there. So I want to just wrap up with briefly with the pursuit of the victims and how important it was for me to try to identify them, because of course that image is not how, obviously that's not how anyone should be killed or anyone should be murdered, and with their family. And family is a huge theme of the book as far as victim groups and the thinking of in genocidal thinking, why it's important, root and branch, to kill family units. And trying to restore those names and the lives and the histories of those families was a real kind of mission I tried to undertake in this study. And I had very little evidence to start to embark on this mission. And here's an example of that. This is in 1944 when the Soviets came back in and or Soviet Commission just started to list names by hand. But it's fragmentary. And I think in our Holocaust memorial culture, we are so used to naming names on Yom HaShoah, which is such a powerful and important way of honoring the victims and restoring their lives. Or we talk about victims in huge numbers, 6 million or 33,000. And I just started to think more and more about thinking about victims in a way of humanizing them as a kind of a family unit and those family relationships. And here we see little like quasi-family configurations of, you know, because we have surnames and we have birth dates. And I noticed in the image that it's very difficult to identify the mother. We don't know her age. It's hard to tell, but we can tell that that little boy is kind of a toddler and somewhere kind of between the age of like 3, 5, 6. And so I started to just focus on birth dates between 35, maybe 39, and to go through the boy, like as more as something that could be more easily determine the age of the boy, and then zero in on family units from Mirapole. Something like 960 is the number of Jews who died during the Holocaust in Mirapole. We have about 214 names and then another about 400 total. So we only have half the names of the victims. And this is typical. This is reflective of the reality in Ukraine, where most of the victims have not been identified, certainly most of the children. And one way of going about this is through genealogical research by working with Yad Vashem. This is a page of testimony from Yad Vashem in which survivors come in and fill out these forms and try to explain, you know, here very specifically names of family members, where they died and any information. And I was just really struck by this testimony, this page of testimony, because first of all, there's a photograph here, and like 1% of the page of testimonies actually include photographs. And it was so, such a beautiful image. And for me, it was so much more something I wanted to look at a lot longer than the other one and really study. And I was glad to find a photograph of another family from Mirapole. Could it be the one in the picture? This boy really, you know, stood out, and this could be the mother, and this could be the child on the mother's lap who's on her knee in front of the smoke. She's obscured in the smoke. So this is the Vasalyuk family, and Svetlana Budnitskaya, who was born in 1936, a child during the war and had been evacuated, was testifying on behalf of her cousins. These are her cousins. This is her father's sister, and came back and got this document, this photograph. It was taken in 1941 during the Nazi occupation. It's the image of what's left of a Jewish family, of how they want to be remembered and photographed, not the one that, you know, the atrocity image, the murder image. And I interviewed Svetlana, but she was not able to make the identification with certainty. And that's part of the kind of ambivalence of this book, of the search for the missing, and in fact, what I call the missing, the families and individuals entire communities that have been wiped out, to the extent that there's no one left to actually come forward and register them as missing. And here they are. And this is about witness testimony collection of the Ukrainians as well. And you can see I'm showing this to one of the a woman who worked in the paper factory, and her boss was Jewish, and she interacted with the Jewish community, and she recognized some of the women in this photograph. And then during the interviews I conducted with the Yehad Nunim, she started to just remember, as she looked at the image, more names of victims, more family names that I didn't have on my original list. So that was important as well, and how much these images can trigger memories. And this peasant who was witnessing the massacres as well, and describing them to me in vivid detail. Again, we didn't show the atrocity photo until the end of our interviews, but it was fascinating how these Ukrainians have these very specific kind of glimpses and shards of memory that do corroborate the action, the evidence in the photo. Here's another witness. And there's our photographer and his testimony. This is the walk to the crime scene with the Yehad Nunim team. And this is the landscape today, which is really very unusual. The depressions, I'm sorry, this photograph probably doesn't convey it as well as it should, but it's definitely the vegetation and the ground is completely disrupted from the investigation that the Soviets carried out. And so much so that even in 2016, the summer of 2016, when we were there, we kind of just reached down into the muck of the soil, and we found these bones. We found vertebrae, we found skull fragments, because this had been completely dug up in this way, in a very kind of rough way, including using tractors. And so this is part of the reason why that site is really such a mess today. I just want to close because I want to leave time for questions, and I've been talking too much about the shoes, and read a little bit from the end of the book. The empty shoes and the crumpled coat exist there as questions, as gaps in knowledge. They remind us of the victims who we cannot see, and the many who were murdered and remained missing. Like flawed testimonies and memories, photographs can mislead because they can never completely capture the reality of the event pictured or those involved. The Jewish man who was murdered, perhaps with his family, is not there, although his empty shoes and crumpled coat remain. We cannot see beyond the frame of the image. We can't turn 360 degrees to take in the entire setting of the victims waiting to be killed, other possible onlookers, including our Slovakian photographer and his comrades, and more German officials. The papers are strewn amid the bullet casings. At the edge of the mass grave could be German lists or Jewish identity documents. Atrocity images, especially the rare ones that attest to the acts of genocide, the crime of all crimes, offend and shame us. When we turn away from them, we promote ignorance. When we display them in museums without captions and download them from the internet with no historical context, we denigrate the victims. And when we stop researching them, we cease to care about historical justice, the threat of genocide, and the murdered missing. Thank you very much. Look forward to your questions.
Thank you, Wendy. That's really, really enlightening and really difficult. And thank you for walking us through that difficult material. There are, for questions and answer, or for questions now, the best way is probably to use the question and answer feature, the Q&A feature at the bottom of the screen, and then I will relay them to Wendy. And Wendy, feel free to jump in, add anything else beyond, of course, these questions. Let me sort of ask the first question, if I can, which was maybe a little bit about your intentions in writing this book. did you know when you saw the photograph, did you know that you wanted to spend, I don't know, 3, 4, 5 years going around the world? Just research of this photograph took you to Israel, to Ukraine, of course, to Slovakia, to Southfield, Michigan, um,
Mm.
starting in Washington, D.C. Did you know that that would become a book and would become a much larger project than it was? Or at what point did it stop being? Because for me, it's not just about the photograph; it's all the stories you tell. And in that final passage that you read, it's also about what it means to try to understand something through a medium like photography. When did it go from being or what was your process of going from a photograph to what I see as a much larger project?
Mhm, mhm. When I first looked at it, I immediately focused on the theme of collaboration. And I ended up publishing an essay in a collected a volume edited by Alex Kay and David Stahel and others, Philip Rutherford, on the war in the Soviet Union and kind of the Axis, the collaboration side of it, the military side. And I contributed a chapter on the Holocaust and included this image as a kind of illustration, but I also contextualized it as part of kind of the story in that history. And in fact, when Lubomir Skrovina, the photographer, and he died in 2005, so I wasn't able to interview him, but I interviewed his family. And the reason why I was able to show the image of the actual camera that he used to take that picture was because he donated it to the Museum of Jewish History in Bratislava. And interestingly, in his letter to the museum, he was very specific. He said, he said, I want you to display my camera in an exhibit on the Holocaust, which has yet to happen. It hasn't happened. It wasn't happening when I returned there in 2017. Then he said, and I want to point out the Ukrainian collaboration in this photo. And so at the time, and even till today, this is a very important topic in Holocaust studies, and I would say genocide studies more broadly. I think it needs to be dealt with. I think we need to look at the collaborators in the Turkish genocide more carefully and understand what was going on and the overlaps with the war there, and how this ideology, or the anti-Semitism in this case, or the opportunism or the greed, or all those facets of genocide come together, and they cross ethnic cultural lines, kind of on the perpetrator side, I think is important, and how people kind of get involved, and the extent of complicity and the kind of division of labor and all those pieces. So that was really where I was going with it initially, and on the perpetrator side. But I didn't, and it was an article. And I guess I really started to take shape as a book, and really became a book, I would say, when I was at the museum in 2017, so just a few years ago, because there are discoveries in this book that I could not, and work that is evident in this book that I could not have done on my own. So the camera, and finding the family, the photographer's family. I mean, I had the contours of the story. I knew that, I had figured out through his testimony that it was his enough moment, that he wasn't such a bad guy, that he wasn't like the collaborator I thought he was, taking such degrading photos. But getting the camera, and so my colleagues at the museum, I gave them all my research. I was working on artifact collection, so I could draw from certain resources. And by the way, I should put the disclaimer in that the museum gives no, this is my interpretation. These are my mistakes in my interpretation. That's my to own. So, but to the point of how we have these incredible resources in our national institutions and around the world to do this work, and that it does take a community of scholars, because I wouldn't have dared move out of my, realm of like Ukraine and Germany, I wouldn't have dared to start writing about Slovakian testimony because I couldn't read it. And so I had to draw on, colleagues and survivors at the museum, volunteered to translate these Slovakian documents, descendants of survivors and victims. And it's, as I mentioned at the beginning of my talk, the response has been like that as well. That, when you open up your research like this and you have these conversations, and you're discussing like what it is you're looking for, and it's just this kind of input from your colleagues, and that community that's just is really remarkable, and can yield these kinds of results and these kinds of discoveries. So I was pleased with that, but I also realized too that I could show that to readers, just all the kinds of methods that could be employed and perspectives and approaches. And maybe students of history outside of Holocaust studies and genocide studies would benefit from that as well, just as a scholarly kind of project and display of that.
Yeah, great, thank you. And now the question bin is filling up here. So I'm actually going to try to group a few of them together. One is can you tell us more about the photographer? Because that is actually a fascinating chapter within the book. So I know that you can. And just a little bit about his experience, how it was that you found he wasn't the collaborator that one imagined you would have to be at the scene like that. And then following on that, there's a series of questions about teaching with photography. One question reads, as a Holocaust teacher, I stress that most of the photographs are from the point of view of perpetrator, and that matters. Can you point us to any Jewish or other victims photographs? And then a related question, as you acknowledge, these photos are incredibly difficult to look at, yet we cannot and must not turn away. How would you recommend using an image like this one in teaching, with undergrads in particular? How could we use such an image to teach about both perpetrators and victims without dehumanizing the victims, especially when time is limited? And then finally, one last photography question coming from a photographer herself. A photographer and a Holocaust scholar, Diana Mara Henry, which is, did you mention in the description, in the photograph, it does appear that two of the perpetrators might be smiling. Is that your interpretation as well? And since I've mentioned Diana's name, I should also mention Beth Kreisman as the Holocaust teacher, Borden Painter with a question about the photographer, and our colleague Avi Pat with the question about teaching undergrads. So that's a lot all at once.
Yeah, I'll try to,
consolidated, but love to hear your reactions.
Yeah, I know it's tough when you're teaching. I'm going to start with some of the teaching photography ones before I get into the photographer's bio. There are fantastic photographs taken by Jews in the ghettos primarily. In the Łódź ghetto, there was a fantastic exhibit at the Boston Museum of Fine Arts, I think that's where it was, about Heinrich Ross and how, Jewish photographers, Jews actually were very active in the occupation, the field of photography, and had many photo studios. And that photo studio from Mirapol, the photo I showed you of that family, was taken there, for instance. So this was a field, and the late David Schneer's work is really important in this regard, in showing us how these Soviet Jewish photographers were very active, and they came out of the arts, and I mean, even out of the kind of Soviet realism school and so forth. So it's kind of Jews as an occupation, and within their communities and family photographs were themselves very active in this field. And so it comes into the history of the Holocaust as far as that ability and the equipment and the material and the chemicals and all of that is there. And so we do have wonderful photographs from the Kovno ghetto, for instance, and I worked on an exhibit at the museum years ago on that, and had the opportunity to meet Kaddish, the photographer, the survivor, describing his clandestine photos, and others from the Łódź ghetto. And Jews were knew the power of this evidence. One of the most famous images from Lipaia, Latvia, and the shooting of a Jewish family, the Epstein family, the matriarch is standing there in their undergarments. A Jewish technician who found those photos in the Gestapo offices and of his community, fallen community members, murdered community members, who secretly reproduced those photos, and they were brought to Nuremberg, and buried them. And so this is very much a part of the history of the Holocaust, of Jews taking these photographs to document what's happening to their communities, bringing them to the authorities after the war as best they could, and to memorialize them. Here is a famous photographer, Bella Liebman, who took these images in the Szeged ghetto of the Jews who had been deported. And here after the war, the search for the missing, like going through their shoes, and how the shoes again become part of the search and the identification of victims. And this was also used in a trial in Canada after the war. So there's a wonderful history of kind of Jewish photography and its applications to the Holocaust and to the pursuit of justice. So that might be a very important way of also, if you did a segment in teaching on photography, to point out these different activities and the forms that it takes, not always the perpetrator's gaze, not always at the perpetrator's trophy images or humiliating images. And so that students realize that there are different perspectives through the camera, and that they're all attempts to document and provide a visual testimony as to what's happening, that people are conscious of the magnitude of these historical events, and are deliberately taking these images to document them. And our photographer, that was his thinking. When he was interrogated in 1943 by the Slovakian kind of secret police in Bratislava, he was hauled in and questioned for having such incriminating photos, again by the Soviet authorities in 1958 and 1959, and he was immediately assumed to be complicit with those images. And in his testimony, we see how he got out of that being prosecuted in the way that he answered those questions and the value of that testimony. But we also have his unofficial, more personal records, letters that he wrote to his wife, who was involved in their kind of resistance effort. He, 25-year-old, took that, he was 25 years old when he took that image that we focused on today. And that was his turning point. And he got out of service. He went back to Slovakia. He said, I never want to wear a uniform. I didn't sign up for this war. And it's important for students to realize that this was, forced military service, that not everybody in uniform, is guilty or complicit, and to look at each biography.
He essentially deserted, right? Is that
he didn't go? No, he was relieved of duty because of illness.
Okay.
Okay, so he was in an asylum. He basically checked himself into an asylum, and his wife was coming to visit him, and they were kind of playing this out. But he was then joined the resistance, used his skills as a radio operator and the material he had with photography, hid a Jewish family in his attic, showed them these atrocity photos and said, don't go east when you're deported. This is what is in store. One of the individuals he hid in his attic was an OBGYN. He actually delivered his son. This photographer had a son in 1943 in their house in that attic with this Jewish family. Brought that Jewish family to the woods in 1944, and there's documentation on the Slovakian side for that kind of rescue activity and that resistance activity. He received honors from the Slovakian government for being a resistor. So that truth came out as far as his biography. But yeah, it's very difficult to teach with these images, but to not deal with them is also, I think, a greater risk. And I've had some experience with that. For instance, I often assign students, I assign the book by Sharon Slavinsky, Human Rights in Camera, and we look at the role of visual imagery in the growing awareness of human rights violations, going back to the French Revolution, actually. And I asked the students in their assignment to go out and find their images that they think are most powerful representations of human rights abuses, and to provide little briefs on those images. And it's always a revealing moment as far as what's on the internet, what's the kind of the misinformation that's out there, the sources, the sites where they are housed, where they're lodged, and that the students aren't capable of kind of deconstructing these images in a way and asking the questions that they should be asking as far as the photographer, the statement that's trying to be made, the perspective, the angle, what might be cropped, the context, the aesthetic pieces of it, the evidentiary pieces of it. So, rather than do these PowerPoint lectures and give students books that have these illustrations with no captions, and just say, okay, just allow that. I think it's more important to just say, wait a minute, our entire culture is so visual. We've got to develop that literacy. And this is a Holocaust and Genocide Studies course. So this is something that we should deal with. But you have to do it with care, because you cannot put something out there like I put out in the beginning of my presentation without the discussion beforehand, without the context, obviously, and also to choose images that don't further repeat the trauma in a way of maybe someone else who's gone through something like this, and as well the violence of the victims, the humiliation of the victims. I avoid images that show nude, corpses, piled up corpses, and so that's part of the decision making you have to make as an instructor, as a teacher.
Great, thank you. And just let me follow up the one question about the, does it seem to you like in the photograph itself, the perpetrators, some of them are smiling?
They are, as best as I could tell, they're kind of grimacing, kind of smirking, and some of that expression is also, especially in the photo that is the focus of the book, is a clenching of the teeth. That kind of, he's actually just in a shooting position with his legs and his arms, and that's part of that expression. But it's possible. I mean, the testimony that the Germans gave on the scene as they witnessed it was a lot of alcohol, singing the funeral march, taunting, ridiculing the victims, and torturing them in that way. So it's possible. Yeah.
And there's no way to know if the image came at the beginning of the filling of the grave, the beginning of the massacre, or at the end. I mean, the pit itself is cropped out of the, not cropped, but is not in the frame, and so.
I do think it's towards the beginning, or at least the first group that was killed, because of the other. There were 5 photos that our photographer took, and they are reprinted in the book, and you can see the way they are a visual testimony. There's a sequence to them. They're not random. He's trying to show us, a photographer, here they are marching, here they are being killed, here are the ones who resisted on the way to the pit and wants to document Jewish resistance. And here's the actual corpses in the pit. He takes it from above. And in the other images of the shootings, including the one that I showed you of the woman alone with the white garment, that's one of those pits that they quickly dug, the trench that was quickly dug. And that happened after, when they realized they had miscalculated. So, I didn't show you that one, but I won't show it to you. But we can see that there were ultimately 2 trenches and one big pit, and this is the larger pit here that you saw in the image. Yeah.
Right. Good. A question from Marina Lomacchino about you had mentioned that the Nazi who came in 1969 to report the crime. What were the reasons that he, I assume it was a man, that he did so?
Yeah, it's a really interesting case, because he is a person I couldn't quite figure out his motive, because the prosecutor and the others in his unit, especially the others in his unit, but the prosecutor kind of bought into it in the end. Case closed for insufficient evidence, basically, after a year. But his comrades, of course, were not pleased with him starting this case. And they said he was mentally unstable, that he was retired, an older man at the time, that he was out to get money and inheritance because he denounced a family member on another case, that he had other motives, and that he was not a credible witness. So that person, his name is Hoffman, was a complicated individual to figure out as far as his motives. So he says, these were horrific events that have haunted me, and I have to, I finally have to tell the truth. But I don't know. I don't know what his motive was.
I mean, it could have been, I suppose, all of those things.
A vendetta.
Yeah.
It could have been a local vendetta. So many of the cases on the German side, they start with a photograph. I have a section in the book about some of the more successful West German cases, because the West German record of justice is not as, in terms of numbers and conviction rates and cases specifically on the Holocaust, in stark contrast to what happened in the Soviet Union. But yeah, they start often with a photograph, because it's so incontrovertible and so damning. The few cases that we have, including the Strott case that are referred to from Liepaja, the Epstein family, was because that photograph had been saved by that Jewish technician and the laborer who was working in the Gestapo office. So, the West German case would have probably gone another route if this photograph were out there. It just evolved into kind of a he said, she said.
Yeah. Talking about the photograph for a second, there's a question related to it, but I just wanted to point out in the book you describe, in a few different instances, blowing up, magnifying, massaging the lighting on the photograph to try to get better details. And I thought that was fascinating. My colleague Eve Zucker, my co-instructor Eve Zucker, asks whether you've used, or do you know of researchers who use facial recognition technologies to identify perpetrators and victims in photographs like that?
Wow, that's a great question. I didn't employ that. I mean, of course, I put this on Google Images, and I found it on a kind of obscure Russian website, and so it had gotten into the internet shortly after I saw it in 2009. And then after I published that article, I think that was 2012 or 13, it was kind of out there too. It was also on display, blown up and put on display in an exhibit at the museum on complicity and collaboration. And I had the opportunity to just observe visitors responding to that photograph. That was part of my research too. And I also interviewed some of the museum visitors. I was curious.
Can you say what some of those responses were?
It was blown up in a way and placed in a display that provided a little bit of a kind of, not like a little room, a little space, and the lighting was a little bit darker, and it created a kind of like a little vestibule, a little privacy. And so I so appreciated the way they did that as far as the design element there. And so people lingered, people felt like it was okay to stand there and look at that, and were disgusted and would look and then shake their head, and usually the reaction was outrage and disgust. How could they do that? How could they do that? And that's in the museum, the Holocaust Museum. These are self-identifying visitors volunteering to go to the museum. So had that kind of shock value, if you will. But we know, the photographer, when he was interrogated in 58, he said, I wanted to show the entirety of the scene. When he was questioned specifically about this photograph, he said, I wanted to show the entirety of the scene. And part of me, believes him as far as what he wanted to, his thesis, as it were, that these are these collaborators shoulder to shoulder. This is this is his family. She's holding this little boy's hand, what we see, and the horror of that and how wrong it is. But when he says very deliberately, I wanted to show the entirety of the scene, knowing what I've come to know of the photographer, who's incredibly smart. He didn't have I think he had a technical education, kind of went to a Volksschule, kind of a high school education. But as one of his denouncers say, be careful, he's clever as a fox. He'll outsmart you. When he said that so deliberately, like, I wanted to capture the entirety of the scene. He's a really skilled photographer. He has his own dark room in his house and all of that. Like, I wonder what he cropped out. Like, there are no Slovakians in this picture. And he was there, he was not the only Slovakian there. He was there with at least one other Slovakian. He described going to the scene with him. He heard the shooting and his commander said, go check it out. And he grabbed his camera and went with his lieutenant. He was a corporal, and the two of them went. And obviously he's close to the scene. But I just thought it was interesting that of the 5 photos he took, there are no Slovakians pictured there as kind of collaborators. And that may be why he was able to also avoid prosecution when the Soviets were really hunting traitors to the homeland, the fascist collaborators, because they're not in the picture there.
We have just enough time to, I think I'm going to again group the last 3 questions that we have here together. Some of them will be shorter answers, some of them will be longer. Diana, who asked the question before, has another one, which I find interesting because this is also a story of the Holocaust by bullets that is still, I think, I don't want to make it sound comparative or competitive, but underrepresented compared to the Holocaust by gas chamber, at least in the American imagination. Do you know if the work of Father Dubois has changed the sort of 6 million figure that's commonly accepted? He said, there have been more identified victims, or the identification that there have been more victims in the Ukraine in particular. So question 1, does that affect the sort of total number that people use? And I suppose in some ways related to that, a question from Armin Marsubian is, in your research, have you come across other little known photographs that could provide some similarly sort of rich understanding of the events in Ukraine and that area more generally? Then the last question in this batch, slightly unrelated, but I think an important one and relating to your experiences at the U.S. Holocaust Memorial Museum, is how can you explain why the impact of ordinary items like shoes seem to evoke such emotional responses, which comes from Stu Abrams here in Connecticut.
Wow, those are all great questions. I hope I can get to them. Yes, I mean, Father Dubois' work has made some important, opened up some avenues in many respects, as far as encouraging scholars to go to these sites and do that kind of field work and understand testimony and traces in a bigger way, a different tangible way. Also, the witness testimony he has collected. And I found that when we collected the 18 accounts, when I was with his team there, I wanted to kind of put his program to the test as well. I worked with him, and he was uncovering all these sites, and as your questioner said, the changing the numbers and shifting attention to the Holocaust by bullets, and thinking about, what I said before. I thought there were 900,000, but that had been conflated into kind of Soviet victims. And then we looked at Ukraine specifically as the terrain and not kind of the Soviet Union writ large. And then actually realizing that those numbers were higher. So yeah, I guess that does raise the estimate. But I also think that there are, other discoveries as far as deaths in ghettos, and those numbers are kind of uncertain as well. I mean, it's, these are estimates, I can't tell you if 6 million is right or wrong. My colleague Dieter Pohl says it's a little bit less. It's like 5 point something. It's it's that magnitude, and it's why these single sources are so important as far as if we're really striving for precision. It's not going to change the kind of the magnitude of this, the 6 million, as it were, but it does bring into sharper relief and fill in this important history as to how and why, because we are dealing like with very specific events outside of that administrative bureaucratic system of the camps, of the gassing centers, where people were registered and tattooed. Now, there were many who were, we have very few documents from the Axiom-Reinhardt camps, and one that turned up some years ago that was during the war with the numbers from Treblinka and so forth. So these are still being kind of determined as we get into the archives. And a lot of these archives are just, these things are coming out in my lifetime and during my own research. So the number 6 million appeared long before we really kind of drilled down to this level of specificity of looking at these lists and looking at these singular sources. The number I don't anticipate is going to change dramatically, but what we are learning is within that estimate of 6 million, we're starting to get a better sense of how this was happening on the ground to individuals, who was involved, that it was very much a European story, the various methods that were employed, the collaboration as a phenomenon, as I mentioned, and how it was documented or not, and how it was covered up. So that's what's happening here, and that's the story, right? That's the reality of the human experience, not the number, but this event as we see it in the photograph. There are other phenomenal photographs, and interestingly, many of them come from Ukraine, these kinds of murder images. One that my colleague Valerie Hebert is working on in Canada, a Canadian scholar, on Mizoch, a very famous series of women in their undergarments kind of lined up, and they're in the pit and they're being killed. And this is the summer of 1942, during this wave in the summer of 42. And that shows a Ukrainian militia walking around with their guns, finishing them off, I think is the caption there in that image. So yes, there are a few dozen of these kinds of images, and that's another question in terms of why there are so few when you think about the magnitude of of 6 million, and when you do come across them, you better well, my view, you better well research them, because there are so few. And as we learned in my book, I mean this is, as far as I can tell, this is the only trace in terms of documentation of this event, of what happened in Mariupol. Yeah, we don't have any German documents on this from the wartime.
And if you go back to the map, I mean, Mariupol is one dot in a cloud of villages with significant Jewish populations in that area.
Yeah.
Presumably, there may have been a massacre. And I don't know about every one of those, but at that same, at similar villages throughout that area, without the same level of the single photograph to document it.
Yeah.
Even the same.
Maybe we should just end a little bit on the so people can exhale on the shoes. I didn't read this in the book, but to the question about the shoes, this is coming from the survivors. The shoes, the symbolic nature of this, and of course it predates this as well. When you think about Van Gogh's image of the shoes and Heidegger's reflections on the shoes, and so this is out there. And as I looked at atrocity photography from other genocides, they're kind of lurking there. So I find it a fascinating kind of metaphor. But Suits Caver, right? And it's in the book, when he discovered his deported mother's shoes in the Vilna ghetto in Lithuania. They had been deported, and then he was still in the ghetto sorting through the belongings of the Jews who had already been killed, because then those items came back to be kind of repurposed. And his poem that he wrote at that moment, which is pretty astounding to then launch into this. The feet from these boots with buttons outside, or these with no body, or these with no bride. Where is the child who fit in these? Is the maiden barefoot who bought these? Slippers and pumps. Look, there are my mother's, her Sabbath pair, in with the others. This was January 1943. And in Sitzkaver's poem, the shoes, they exist somewhere between the living and the dead, among the children, the maidens, and the brides at the wedding or observing Sabbath. His shoes dance and patter. They stimulate our ability to imagine the past and provide poetic testimony to the lives of the wearers, unlike those haunting but inert objects we see today, enshrined behind glass in Birkenau or bronzed as a memorial alongside the Danube River in Budapest. One photograph, too, can pass across time and space from its creator to family members, prosecutors, curators, historians, and the viewing public. It can put things in motion and elicit from those who study the image or are questioned about it an avalanche of information and emotion, and it tugs at our ethical sensibilities. At first sight, such a photo shocks and repels. It seems impossible. But the afterlife of the photograph can become an ongoing story with twists and turns. And like testimony given in words, it can be subject to manipulation, such as cropping and airbrushing. So that's part of how I bring the shoes in at the end. That's
well said. And so I think that's, I'll quote one more, it's a comment, not a question, as we so often do in academia, but the comment, which I will plagiarize verbatim from Sergio Luzzatto, is, what an authoritative, compelling, thoughtful, and thought-provoking presentation. Thank you. So I echo that comment entirely. I'm really grateful you were able to spend time with us this afternoon, and I hope I hope that those of us, that many of us who are here in the Yale New Haven community will get a chance to continue to meet with you and to converse with you as long as you are still in the area. And the weather is nice, and who knows, vaccinations.
I know, and so I'll be here till early May, and I'm getting my second shot on April 5th. So I'm really
Great. Well, you're ahead of me.
Okay.
But that's wonderful. It's wonderful to read the book.
Thank you so much
about it. Thank you so much for coming.
Yeah, thank you. Have a wonderful afternoon. Thank you, everybody.
Thank you. Just one word for the audience. We have our second GSB seminar of the semester will be actually next Thursday. Charles Anderton from the University of the Holy Cross, talking a very different direction of political economic models of genocide prediction and prevention. So if you can shift gears with me, you're all invited, and keep your eyes out for the poster for that talk. Thanks for coming, everybody. I'm glad you were able to make it, and the weather outside is beautiful. I recommend after dealing with heavy material like this, I recommend a walk in the sunshine. So
yeah, that sounds good to me. Thank you. Bye-bye. Bye.